is Dale Jamieson, and I'm the chair of the Department of Environmental Studies and was the founding director of the Animal Studies Initiative. And I want to thank the Center for the Humanities, the Department of Anthropology, the Institute of French Studies, the Maison Française, and of course the Department of Environmental Studies and the Animal Studies Initiative for making this event possible. I would also like to collectively thank a number of individuals who are behind all of these institutions who actually did the real work of getting us all to the same place at the same time tonight. And finally, I want to bring to your attention the next event in this series on the environmental humanities, which is Love and Death in the Anthropocene, which will be on October 24th with Ulrich Baer, the writers Bonnie Nadzim and Roy Scranton, and Dale Jamieson. So. I'm hard to avoid around here. So our speaker tonight is Professor Philippe Descola, who was born in Paris in 1949, studied philosophy at the École Normale Supérieure, before, as he said to me earlier today, renouncing philosophy and moving on to study anthropology with Claude Lévi-Strauss. Professor Descola spent the late 1970s doing field work in the Amazon basin, studying the networks of sociability that relate human and non-human actors. And this work resulted in his PhD dissertation, and the degree was awarded in 1983. After teaching and researching at various universities and institutions, both in France and around the world, he was appointed to a chair at the Collège de France in 2000, where he directs a joint laboratory on social anthropology in cooperation with several other institutions. Professor Descola is the author of many books and articles, including his 1993 very personal account of living with the Achuar in the Ecuadorian Amazon, a book that was published in English under the title The Spears of Twilight, Life and Death in the Amazon Jungle. Now, one way of understanding Professor Descola's original and profound contributions is to reflect on the name of the chair that he holds at the Collège de France. There he is the professor of the anthropology of nature. Now, on first hearing, this may sound like an oxymoron. By its very name, anthropology is supposed to be about people. But for Professor Descola, there is no understanding people without understanding the more than human world in which they are enmeshed. Now, we New Yorkers, like Parisians or indigenous Amazonians, cannot be understood without seeing us in relation to our plants and animals. In our case, our lapdogs, the persecuted trees in our parks, the kale that travels from distant lands to wind up in our clean food restaurants. As my colleague Colin Jerolmak has shown, we even need to understand those flying rats, those pigeons that were introduced to North America in the 17th century to class up our cuisine. Now, the great lesson of this, in my opinion, is that rather than being an oxymoron, all anthropology must ultimately be an anthropology of nature. For what else could it be? But that's me talking. Before turning over the floor to Professor Descola, let me leave you with his own explanation of his project, drawn from his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France. On that occasion, he said that he wanted to, quote, understand the unity of man through the diversity of the means that he adopts for objectifying a world from which he cannot dissociate himself. It is an honor to welcome Professor Descola to NYU, who will now speak to us on an inquiry into the metaphysics of others.
Many thanks to the different institutions at NYU that made this visit possible, and especially to Dale Jamieson for inviting me to talk to you tonight. I understand this is a talk in the series of the environmental humanities. I won't talk directly about the environmental humanities. I will, although it will be upon this. The main topic of the lecture tonight is how do you manage to translate more or less adequately a cosmology into another cosmology. And of course it's a question of translation, and anthropology, it has been said very often, is a question of translation. Some things do translate from one world to another, others much less. And cosmologies are almost untranslatable, and I'll try to explain why. Some 20 years ago, in the introduction of a special issue of the journal, the French Journal of Anthropology, L'Homme, which was devoted to Amazonian societies, and Christine Taylor, my companion, and we wrote the following sentence. I quote, "Structuralism works well in Amazonia because native peoples there appear to be spontaneously structuralist." It seemed to us at the time, and it still does, that the propensity of Amerindians to use concrete properties observable in the environment to construct highly intricate conceptual relations did meet characteristic features of structural analysis, in particular its capacity to render manifest complex symbolic assemblages out of the encapsulation of secondary qualities gleaned on the surface of phenomena. And we were convinced that this Amazonian propensity had been, via Lévi-Strauss' Brazilian ethnographic experience, one of the sources of inspiration for his peculiar mode of anthropological thinking. In other words, beyond the two Platonic spouses that Lévi-Strauss claimed, which are on the one hand structural phonology, and on the other hand Darcy Thompson's brand of morphogenesis, and beyond his three no less Platonic void mistresses, Marx, Freud, and geology, we thought it was necessary to recall the role played by a companion he had met in his youth, Amazonian thought, as expressed in myth and institution. A companion which had never ceased to exert upon him a charm all the more profound that it could not be reduced by contrast with the others to propositional formulae. And to this idea of a resonance between, on the one hand, the nature of the structural method, and on the other, the nature of the object with which it was initially experimented, Lévi-Strauss, whom I met in a corridor at the time I was preparing this special issue, contented himself with remarking, "Here you went a bit far." So in a way, this paper it will be a reflection on Lévi-Strauss' comment. What does Lévi-Strauss' reply suggest? It begs a question that could be formulated in the following way. When an anthropologist studies how some natives think, to use a convenient formula, and strives to give an account of it, how are we to discriminate between three distinct strands? First, the information, first-hand or reported, that she makes use of, mainly statements and actions often disconnected from one another. Second, the affinity that she senses between the discursive and behavioral style that she observes and the modes of conceptualization that are familiar to her or that she has learned to appreciate, and finally, the greater or lesser degree of reflexivity with which the propositions she analyzes are endowed. I will return in a moment to the vexing question of studying how natives think. I wish presently to focus on my remarks upon certain conceptual properties of the anthropological discourse itself and its relation to our own mode of reflexive thinking, namely philosophy, precisely. This is a question which takes all the more important in the French context, as a great number of French anthropologists and social scientists, ever since the beginning of the 20th century, even before that, myself included, first majored in philosophy before embracing an anthropological career. A situation which contrasts in that respect with that of the other great anthropological nations. Philosophical parlance comes spontaneously to us, even when, as is most commonly the case, we have chosen to yield to an anthropological vocation out of a disenchantment with academic philosophy. That is, as it was taught at least in France during my youth, as a system of thought mainly concerned with a reflexive exegesis of its own conceptual genesis, and thus, obviously, generally indifferent to questions raised elsewhere in terms that, for most of its history, philosophy did not strive to understand. A few words to begin with on the originality of philosophy by contrast with other forms of speculative thought to which other civilizations offer us a testimony. Philosophy, it seems to me, is not so much specific by the objects it has elected to deal with. Some are proper to it, others not, than by a blending of traits which one does not find combined elsewhere, except perhaps in theology. Philosophy is reflexive, it creates new concepts, and it pretends, even if it's only by preteration, to universality. Now, all systems of thought which endeavor to give meaning to human existence and to human enterprises invent original ideas. Less numerous are those that take themselves again and again as objects of reflection and inquiry. And there is none but philosophy which claims, in the wake of the sciences of nature, that its propositions, if only again by preteration, are relevant in absolute terms. And this last proposition is clearly exorbitant, for either the concept that philosophy uses, nature, beings, history, the subject, transcendence, whatever, are either unknown in other ontologies as are the circumstances they designate, or the circumstances that other ontologies try to account for cannot be digested, at least directly, by philosophy. Other circumstances, such as animals that see themselves as humans, dead humans who still act upon the living, mountains that need to be chastised, etc., etc. The consequences appear straightforward. Either philosophy must reform itself in a drastic manner by reviving its presupposition so as to accommodate other ways of thinking, a process which, judging by its antecedents, can be embraced only by a tiny minority of philosophers, or anthropology is to be entrusted with the task of symmetrization, provided it succeeds in borrowing selectively from the rich conceptual depot of Western metaphysics and gnoseology. It seems to me that this latter path is the one which the most stimulating minds in anthropology have decided to follow ever since the end of the 19th century. However, sad as this may be, and for reasons to which I will return in a moment, this symmetrization is condemned to remain incomplete, for its final result is conditioned in its very form by the audience to which it is destined, not, to borrow a celebrated formula from Mauss, the Melanesian of such or such an island, meaning a specific group of people with specific understanding of a situation, but professional anthropologists and more generally the amateurs of reflexive thought whose taste has been formed by 2.5 millennia of European philosophical tradition, and whom one has to address in a language that they are able to understand. So this incomplete symmetrization may also take very different forms according to the types and to the modalities of transfer between the local ideology or ideologies, and when I talk about ideology, it's in the initial sense of a system of ideas, no? And the ideology of the analyst. Three of these forms of transfer are prominent. The most common form of symmetrization, and the oldest one in anthropology, consists in developing the conceptual implications of a local institution in such a way that its relevance will exceed the limits both of the original institution and of the peculiarities of the region of the world where this institution was initially described. So in the early phases of the discipline, this movement of generalization was operated by stretching the meaning of a local concept so as to have it subsume a myriad of disparate phenomena, which generally had for sole common denominator the fact that they did not square with the manner in which the field of practice that the concept reputedly qualified was apprehended in the West. So totem, mana, taboo, shaman, how, and many others were born in such a way. And of course, with positive effects, whatever the critics of essentialism may think, in that this process of extension ultimately meant transforming into philosophical problems or cognitive categories worthy of being taken seriously what were previously perceived as ridiculous superstitions. More recently, it is rather by exploiting intensively the conceptual consequences of an institution, of a process, of a regime of relation, or of an epistemic orientation, stemming from an ethnographic observation, that this operation of generalization is undertaken. So instead of extending disproportionately an initial fuzzy meaning, like mana, for instance, it is, on the contrary, a deepening and an operationalization of a very precisely defined concept that is sought for here. Well-known examples of this process are Dumont's idea of the hierarchical encompassment, Merlin Strathern's notion of the person as an objectification of relations, or Viveros de Castro's perspectivism. That is, theoretical constructs initially intended to account for the disposition of a specific cultural area, but later employed in a much wider context. One may even add to this category Lévi-Strauss' idea of reciprocity as the foundation of social life, which is an intuition initially stemming out of his observation of the working of the borrower moieties, but which later acquired in his sociological work a seminal dimension quite divorced from the actual functioning of dualist societies. In all these cases, the originality of these local models turned into paradigms, and the very principle of their constitution result from the stark contrast they present implicitly or explicitly with the Western way of perceiving and conceptualizing the field of phenomena that these models account for. So Frazerian totemism, for instance, contrasts with the idea of a separation between nature and society. Dumontian hierarchical encompassment contrasts with possessive individualism. The Haussian, the Maussian, how contrasts with the logic of commoditization, etc., etc. So here the generalization of a cultural relative renders relative what was then seen hitherto as a generalizing principle. Let's move now to the second form of symmetrization. It consists in transforming an account of a native way of thinking into a more or less systematized corpus similar to a philosophical doctrine, at least in its mode of presentation. This is also a very ancient tendency in the West, and one that even predates the former type of symmetrization, since it has been a characteristic feature during several centuries of a certain type of missionary anthropology. The Historia General de las Cosas de Nueva España, compiled in Nahuatl by Bernardino de Sahagún in the 16th century, is probably the earliest example of these trends, while the Lettres édifiantes et curieuses written by the Jesuits from China are their most celebrated expressions, if only because of the role they played in the formation of Leibniz ideas. Apart from these, from their indisputable ethnographic value, these documents evidence a real interest in pure knowledge and no less real admiration for the subtlety of the concepts and the intellectual operations they describe, combined to less elevated considerations into which entered notably the wish to extol the difficult achievements of converting genuine scholars whose intellectual constructions were as complex as those of their evangelizers, and also the desire to show that some of these constructions actually prefigured in spirit, if not in letter, certain truths of the divine message or some entities of Western metaphysics. A more modern expression of this ancient trend is the famous philosophie Bantu of Father Placid Temples, which has triggered a heated debate among African philosophers, some of them such as Alexis Kagame or Mubabinge Bilolo being open to the idea that the law of such or such an African civilization may provide the elements of a true philosophy, while others, I'm thinking here of the Beninese philosopher Paulin Utunji, for instance, see in what he disdainfully dubs as ethnophilosophies nothing more than classical ethnological studies of African representations of the world and the person. Although the debate on alternative metaphysics has raged mainly in Africa, where due to the theological training of some of its participants, it may have appeared sometimes as a sort of revenge of a Thomist philosophy gone native upon the Hegelian philosophy of history and its unabashed claim of European superiority. This kind of proliferation of philosophy in nearby domains is also present in ethnological accounts, properly speaking. Usually it is under the guise of easily recognizable philosophical use, thanks to which an ethnographer describes or depicts the moral and epistemic dispositions of the society he or she studies. Examples are numerous in France due to the influence of philosophy, in particular of Husserlian phenomenology, on the formation of the first generation of ethnographers doing proper fieldworks in the 20s and the 30s. Whether this influence was direct, as in the case of Maurice Lénart, for instance, in New Caledonia, or indirect, as in the case of Marcel Griaule, it had the effect of providing a sort of epistemic paradigm, which, because it ran counter to the dominant positivist cognitive realism of the time, appeared to correspond better to the modes of knowledge and of being present in the world that the ethnographers were encountering in faraway places. And I suspect that this latter aspect is the reason for the continuous favor that phenomenology has enjoyed among anthropologists, who nevertheless belong to very different national traditions, such as Ernesto de Martino in Italy, or Marcelo Bormida in Argentina, or for instance, Irving Hollowell here in the United States. This painting of anthropology with philosophical colors has taken a more decided turn in the past decades, especially in the Anglophone countries, in particular with the late discovery of Merleau-Ponty, and more recently of the work of Deleuze in its more digestible Guattarian form, let's say. Although the invocation of philosophical concepts, and above all of the mighty authority of certain philosophers, has now become standard practice in anthropology, and surprisingly more in its Anglophone brands than in the Francophone ones, this practice often becomes an ambiguous homage. So superficial remains the reference to philosophy, a form of paying lip service, which usually amounts to shrouding under a surreptitiously borrowed conceptual veil the robust empiricism which gives its value to seriously conducted ethnographic inquiries. And actually, the attempts to publicize alter metaphysics and to evaluate, even promote their subversive incidence on our own way of practicing philosophy, much in the way of what was initially endeavored by African philosophers. These attempts are still uncommon, even if the echo aroused by recent philosophically inclined books such as Viveros de Castro, Metaphysics Cannibal, who I understand has been translated into English not long ago, may lead to a movement in that direction. However, whether these attempts at broadcasting alter metaphysics are the work of native authors trained in Western philosophy, as is the case mostly in Africa, or of Western anthropologists drawing the lessons of a native way of thinking according to the canons of exposition of a philosophical work, they all have a very serious drawback. They remain an idiosyncratic exegesis which upsets and bypasses the pragmatic conditions of utterance and of reception of the propositions which reputedly form the basis of this way of thinking. So the mental spell, for instance, that a natural woman addresses to her sweet potatoes are among the data that help me reformulate the notion of animism. Nevertheless, this kind of spell can hardly claim to have the same textual status as Aristotle's posterior analytics. So, although one may not go as far, as Paulin Utunji, the Beninese philosopher I was mentioning a while ago, when he states apropos African ethno-philosophies that they are, I quote, a mere pretext for learned disquisitions among Europeans, one nevertheless must admit that symmetrization in this case is also far from satisfying. The third form of symmetrization does not purport either to generalize the range of a local concept or epistemic stance, or to offer a philosophical counter-model inspired by a local way of thinking, but to compose a combinatorial matrix that would account for all the states of a set of phenomena by bringing to light the systematic differences which oppose its elements. This is, of course, you'll have recognized it, a basic principle of structural analysis, which was defined, I think, in the best way by Jean Pouillon when he wrote, I quote, "Structuralism proper begins when one admits that different sets can be brought together, not in spite, but in virtue of their differences, that when one then tries to order." But why is it a symmetrization? Because in accordance with standard structuralist procedure, the totalization is never given ab initio as the starting point from which the serious of anthropology might structure the world under his imperial gaze, but it results from the always uncompleted operation by the means of which cultural features, norms, institutions, qualities, values, propositions, etc., are constituted as variants of one another within a set. And this set may not only be reconfigured differently if new elements are added, it has no other raison d'être than to subsume the variations for which it provides the encompassing framework. So far from being the intellectual ideology and the immanent logic of a new technocratic totalitarianism, to borrow the exquisitely nuanced formula by which Stanley Diamond qualified the Lévi-Straussian approach, this type of symmetrization is in no way claiming a universalist position of detachment, for it is entirely dependent upon the multiple properties that people detect here and there in phenomena, and it thus requires nothing more in terms of an overhanging perspective or epistemic point than acquiring some knowledge on the diversity of the objects one deals with, which is a modest claim, after all, for what is a scholarly undertaking. I will take two examples of this form of symmetrization, of this third form of symmetrization. La pensée sauvage, and the, which was not impossible to translate into English, but savage mind in the English title, and the matrix of modes of identification that I've propounded in Beyond Nature and Culture. In La pensée sauvage, Lévi-Strauss has accounted with a bewildering virtuosity for one of the most complex and at the same time utterly ordinary mental operations, and one in which has interested philosophers ever since Plato. That is the transformation of sensible qualities into intelligible concepts. And he endeavored to do that by using very humble material, generally disregarded by philosophy, as he looked into how the so-called folk taxonomies exhaust all the aspects of the sensible world in the manner in which they apprehend it at various levels and according to various criteria. The result is a kind of classification which, according to Lévi-Strauss, has a variable pitch as the propellers of a plane. That is, it's a feature also that is not confined to non-literate societies. He thus managed to show in this book what is the logic of the concrete, that is, the ability of the mind, very simply, to establish relations of correspondence and opposition between salient features of our perceived environment and how it works by combining disparate elements of meaning extracted from the phenomenological differences observable in the sensible world, and without in any way presupposing a sort of previous mental template, for instance, a Durkheimian mental projections or an innate psychic prototype. So without presupposing any form of previous mental template, that would be, as it were, superimposed as a filter upon the continuum of perceived objects. Nothing is taken for granted here. Neither a universal cognitive template, only the capacity to detect contrasting qualities in things, nor the superiority of any kind of intellectual procedure over another. For Lévi-Strauss leaves no doubt that there are no real epistemic distinctions to be drawn between magical thought, what he calls magical thought, and scientific thought, which are two equally valid forms of knowledge. They do not differ, he argues, by the kind of mental operations which they both imply, rather by the types of phenomena to which they are applied. and also by the kinds of approaches that they elect to adopt to account for natural phenomena, one very close to sensible intuition, the other more distant. So there is, in my opinion, no doubt that La Pensée Sauvage represents a remarkable attempt at symmetrization in that sense, and one which was actually received as such at the time the book appeared by a host of critics who were horrified by the presumptuousness of the anthropologist when putting on the same plane the intellectual accomplishments of the West and the poor tales of faraway savages. Let us move now, I hope you'll forgive me if I talk a little bit about what I've done myself, to the ontological group of transformation that I propounded in Beyond Nature and Culture. Simply stated, this transformation group purports to contrast modes of identification, that is, framing devices that regulate habitus, guide inferences, filter perceptions, and are largely the products of the affordances which the world offers to the specifically human dispositions. A fundamental function of these framing devices is to ascribe identities by lumping together or dissociating elements of the lived world that appear to have similar or dissimilar qualities. So my argument is that one of the universal features of the cognitive processes into which such dispositions are rooted is the awareness of a duality of planes between material processes, which I call physicality, and mental states, which I call interiority. And by using this universal grid, humans are in a position to emphasize or minimize continuity and difference between humans and non-humans. And this results in a fourfold schema of ontologies, that is, of contrastive qualities and beings detected in human surroundings and organized into systems that I have labeled with conventional labels: animism, totemism, naturalism, and analogism, thus giving new meanings to well-worn anthropological concepts. So the range of identifications based on the interplay of interiority and physicality is indeed limited when confronted with an as yet unspecified allude. I prefer allude to alter because it's a distinction which was made by Vincent Descombes, a French philosopher. Alter is already defined by the relation with whom I enter, and allude is an as yet unspecified term for a relation. So when I am confronted with an as yet unspecified allude, whether human or non-human, a human cognizant subject like myself can surmise either that this object has a similar interiority and a different physicality, and this I call animism, or that the object is devoid of interiority but possesses a kind of physicality similar to that of the subject, and this is what I call naturalism, or that this object shares with other human and non-human elements elements of physicality and interiority that are similar but which altogether differ from those that other humans share with other non-humans, and this I call totemism. Or finally, that this object's interiority and physicality are entirely distinct from the subject's own, even though they display small enough differences to allow for relations of correspondence, and this I call analogism. And each of these combinations affords a glimpse on a more general principle governing the distribution of continuities and discontinuities between any human subject and the object of its environments. Each of these modes of identification serves, moreover, as a touchstone for singular configurations of cosmological systems, of conceptions of the social link, and theories of otherness that are as many instituted expressions of more entrenched mechanisms of recognition of the other. Now, this ontological group of transformation bears a resemblance to what Lévi-Strauss sometimes called the order of orders, namely the upper level of structural articulation of the various systems composing social life, with the slight difference that the articulation here is not a function of an integration of levels that are already analytically defined, but results from a hypothesis as to what comes first in the experience of the world, namely discerning qualities in the objects that surround us, and inferring the kind of relations that they afford. However, the matrix of identification does not work as a philosophical prime mover. Rather, it functions as a sort of experimental device, at least it's in that way that I see it, an experimental device that allows me to capture, thus to bring to existence, and to sort out, thus to combine, certain phenomena so as to highlight the difference of the syntax of their differences. But there is more. By adopting this device, I wanted above all to remain faithful to the basic principle of structural analysis, which holds that each variant is a variant of the other variants and not of any of them in particular, which would be privileged. For if indeed I gave the ontological matrix a fundamental position, on the other hand, none of the variants that it allows, animism, totemism, naturalism, analogism, etc., and none of the variants detectable in other systems, which are as many transformations of the matrix, that is, in the sociological, praxeological, epistemic, cosmological, spatio-temporal, or representational orders, can claim to predominate over any of the other variants. And this was a requirement which I had set upon myself from the start, so as to produce a model of intelligibility of social and cultural facts that would remain as neutral as possible in relation to our own ontology, naturalism. And this is why naturalism is only one of the four possible ontological variants in the matrix. Nevertheless, I have no qualms in admitting that the combinatorial option is wanting as the two other forms of symmetrization, and for reasons that are altogether different. The combinatorial option requires a general knowledge of the institutions and ways of life, let's say, of other people, that only the West has been, until now, in a position to produce. And as such, the structural ontological model depends upon a project of knowledge, which is quite particular. Not so much because of its universalist goal, for there were numerous systems of knowledge elsewhere which purported to be or to account for everything, but because it requires a worldwide exhaustiveness of the empirical data on which it rests upon. So I've reviewed 3 ways of attempting to render symmetrical the anthropological knowledge on others. The exegetical expansion of a local concept, the transformation of local statements into philosophies, the integration of local ideas taken from a number of local settings into a transformational system. None of them achieves a complete symmetry, and I don't think there are other alternatives. So we have to humbly admit a relative failure in that domain. But what is important here, and what many anthropologists fail to see, is that each of these strategies for symmetrization implies a quite different type of bifurcation from what qualifies as ethnographic data. What I call bifurcation are the inferences that the ethnographer makes out of the statements that she listens to, the actions that she observes, inferences that always go beyond, of course, the mere objective descriptions of what there is to see and what there is to hear. But before considering in more detail the 3 types of not symmetrization now, but bifurcation, the bifurcation that allows for the different types of symmetrization, and the various regimes of conceptual autonomy that they trigger, it might be useful to say a few words on the nature itself of the material from which one does bifurcate. What do we usually mean by ethnographical data? By contrast with the material used by philosophers, which are generally discursive constructions imbued with a degree of self-reflexivity, anthropologists rarely deal with a native thought already constituted as a systematic set. They certainly are native scholars and thinkers who combine an extensive knowledge of their culture with a reflexive stance. But there are few. There are few, at least in the anthropological literature, so few that their names, the likes of Ogot Temeli, Ivel Warjok was Rasmussen's main informant, David Kopenawa, the wonderful book that was published recently by Bruce Albert and Kopenawa and translated into English last year, I think. Antonio Guzman was the main informant of Gerardo Reichel-Dolmatov. All these people are in fact quite well known by professional anthropologists. There are very few of them, perhaps a dozen at the most. Most of the time, the information from which we abstract our knowledge is composed of fragmentary and disconnected statements that we recalibrate on the spot in meaningful sequences in order to maintain the thread of a semantic connection with our interlocutors, much as we would do at home in a normal conversation. Even statements that may be minimally structured can appear somewhat enigmatic and require a solid dose of meiotics to be interpreted. For instance, as we warm ourselves by a fire in the still dark house before dawn, an Achwa man tells me that he has dreamt of a man perched in a tree who told him to visit him later in the day in the same spot to meet his sisters. He seems surprised when I ask him what he makes of it, for is it not obvious that the man in the tree is a hollow monkey appearing under human guise, that is according to how the hollow monkey sees himself, who informs the dreamer that he will provide him with spouses, that is, game, that he will be able to hunt. When I get this piece of information, which our conversation offers in passing, and on the same level as comments on the kind of weather we are likely to get today, or whether a sick dog will survive, the first plausible bifurcation it affords is obviously semantic. How am I to understand it? However, it should be emphasized, not for anthropologists who know that quite well, for non-anthropologists. It should be emphasized that when the ethnographer strives to organize the flux of what he sees or hears in organized clusters of meaning or in patterns of behavior, he does not do so initially so much for speculative reasons, but to adjust his own behavior. Understanding, comprehension, verstehen are not only tasty epistemological bones to chew, they have a very practical function. For ethnographic work is an accepted process of socialization and learning which deeply fashions the body, the behavior, and the judgment of an ethnographer immersed into a community of practice. So by inferring among the people she studies coherent patterns of behavior, the ethnographer makes for herself a sort of practical vademecum that will help her to steer the relations she maintains with them, so that she can experience at all times the greater or lesser coincidence of the actions that she both witnesses and takes part into with the interpretation of these actions that she has contrived. I hasten to add that this movement of identification to the observer, of the observer to the observed rather, is an attempt at adequating the self to others, which is not, of course, the sole privilege of ethnographers. However, understanding is not understanding only for oneself. It is also providing an understanding to others, most often to the community from which the ethnographer proceeds. So by becoming public, the interpretations call for other procedures, and thus it changes in nature. And it is here that the second bifurcation takes place, and will subsequently branch out into different paths, some of which correspond to the different forms of symmetrization that I mentioned a while ago. The first two types of symmetrization I mentioned: conceptual intensification, that is, the theoretical operationalization of a feature abstracted from a local description, and exegetic systematization, that is, the translation into philosophical language of an indigenous way of thinking. They call for a type of bifurcation that is primarily inductive. A set of phenomena initially apprehended by the ethnographer within the totality where it was observed will be treated as a variation within a wider set of similar phenomena observable, for instance, in neighboring societies of the same cultural set, which appear to exhibit a regional style. So this operation deprives the original set of phenomena of its apparent exceptionality and makes it explicable as a particular case belonging to a more general cultural model, thus reversing the actual process, which in fact was based on the inductive generalization of a particular. So this kind of bifurcation produces such things as African segmentary systems or Siberian shamanism. Other bifurcations are possible from there, notably those that lead on one side to conceptual intensification, on the other to alternative metaphysics. Both proceed in the same manner, by inductive generalization and recalibration of the statements so as to bring out concepts that synthesize practices which had remained until now unformulated propositionally. In the case of conceptual intensifications, it leads to such constructs as animism, precisely, perspectivism, hierarchical encompassment. In the case of alter metaphysics, it leads to Bantu dynamic ontology, to multinaturalism, to the holographic theory of the subject, to mention Rob Wagner's approach of the Melanesian subject. And the differences between the two types of bifurcation is one of scope rather than method. Conceptual identification, concept intensification, sorry, the jet lag is beginning to take its hold on me. Conceptual intensification as a properly anthropological ambition, since it is a matter of contributing to a better intelligence of the properties of collectives in general by providing a new analytical and classificatory tool stemming from the study of a particular situation. While the exposition of alternative metaphysics or alternative philosophical premises aims at subverting Western metaphysics by showing that other ways are possible for thinking about the presence of humans in the world. On the other hand, the bifurcation which leads to organizing differential features in a combinatorial matrix appears to be of a different nature, since it implies a subordination of induction to the deductive method. Conceptual objects, such as the arborescence of the elementary forms of marriage, for instance, devised by Lévi-Strauss, or the tables of the modes of identification that I've propounded, are not the result of inductive generalizations, of course. They are models. Models, that is, they are material assemblages, graphs, diagrams, charts, relations that are inscribed in documents, which figure in space the structure of a class of phenomena, of which one surmises that they manifest some kind of regularity. So the model is in no way agreed for describing empirical situations. Of course not, and should never be taken as such. It allows the making of hypotheses on the relations existing between phenomena, and thus it allows the study of their formal properties. The means are here adequate to the aim, which is neither to transform a local value into an analytical concept, or to facilitate, so to speak, ontological transliterations, but to tackle a very old problem which anthropology has inherited from comparative law, namely the question of the structural compatibility and incompatibility between certain types of practice, institutions, and ideologies. And the best way I found to do so is to put up models which allow for the detection and the deployment of the ontological premises which underlie regimes of practice and which appear to impart a distinctive style to collectives. At first sight, one might think that an ontological matrix of the kind I propounded cannot be the result of a bifurcation from ethnographic experience, since it appears to imply a complete shift of conceptual framework. But this is not the case. This is not the case because the opposition customarily made between ethnography and anthropology, two kinds of enterprises that would refer to clearly compartmentalized methods and objects, and that authors such as Dan Sperber, for instance, see as epistemologically incompatible. This opposition is here misleading because the detective method that I followed is, of course, not entirely immune from the preliminary procedures which made it possible and which the internal economy of my argumentation led me to render invisible, which is always the case, of course. Actually, it was by a series of inductive generalizations from ethnography, both my ethnography and that of others, that the transformational model of beyond nature and culture progressively took shape. It is from the constantly enriched store of ethnological monographs that anthropologists extract the elements which allow them to bifurcate in such or such direction. And they do so with a know-how which is all the more difficult to formalize, that it rests upon the shared mastery of another know-how, which is fieldwork practice, which renders immediately familiar to us, ethnographers and anthropologists, the rarely explicit procedures of the objectification process by the means of which other ethnographers have collected, filtered, and presented their data. It's because we've done it ourselves that we understand how they did it. This constant shuttle between abstraction and description, between induction and deduction, between direct and mediate knowledge, between local concepts and concepts with universal claims, is probably what makes anthropology a very special science. An art of discovery flavored with a whiff of adventure that does not emanate solely from the peoples with whom we occasionally share our lives, but also, and perhaps mainly, from the unexpectedness of the paths one chooses for being altered by others and making something out of it. Well, if I had the time, the audacity, and the wit, this is probably what I might have replied to Lévi-Strauss' comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. We have about 15 minutes for comments or questions. I would just ask people to be very brief. I think we have microphones that will be circulating.
on. Thanks, Professor. A relatively quick question, I hope, and please take it as being very much from a non-anthropologist. My background's in law. Would be interested in whether you might comment on the literature that's emerged relatively recently about so-called rights of nature or rights for nature, which seems to draw, as far as I can tell, on a lot of thinking from Latin America, in particular Ecuador, and a couple of certain sort of what seem to me to be quite cosmologically specific concepts, and yet is attempting to sort of use those either to, bring some of those concepts into a sort of Western cosmology or prefigure that kind of transfer or exchange or something like that. I wondered whether you see that as a form of symmetrization as you were talking about, and if it's a positive or neutral or a negative attempt at thinking through that relationship.
Thank you for the question. I think we face a problem if we want to reformulate the kind of world we want to live in. So this is beyond anthropology, this is basic politics now. And one of these problems, of course, is to render this world more open to others, both humans and non-humans. That is, try to escape from the distinctly Western ontological and cosmological style that has been defended worldwide. And so law, in my opinion, has an important part in this. It's based in particular the notion of appropriation, the fact that the idea of possessive individualism, which was at the root, in fact, of the political conception and the political economical conception of the appropriation, the progressive appropriation of the world. And this idea of possessive individualism precisely is completely negated by different forms that collectives have adopted over the millennia for thinking the relationship between the land or the world and humans. And I see an interesting combination between the work of, I'm completely ignorant of what is being done here in the United States, but in France there are young specialists in law that are trying to propose models, legal models, whereby it would not be the humans who were at the basis of the appropriation of nature. The title of the first book by Tim Ingold, The Appropriation of Nature. But it would be nature, that is ecosystems, local systems of relations between humans and non-humans that would be endowed with certain rights or certain legal existence, out of which the humans would get their legitimacy as an extension of these rights and perhaps as guarantors of these rights. And so this implies a complete shift in the way we see the relation, the legal relation between humans and non-humans, not as it is mostly done now as an extension to a selective group of non-humans of some rights that were either too restricted to humans. I'm thinking of the Great Ape projects and things like that. That is certain species of animals that can show that they have a sensibility or cognitive capacity that are in a way analogous to that of humans, which in fact is expanding the club. I mean, it's opening the club, the human club, to a small group of people who are persons precisely that we are banned from it. But I much favor rather a complete transformation of the idea that in fact humans appropriate nature, which and of course it has to deal with the this progressive privatization of the commons, which started with the enclosure movement in England at the end of the Middle Ages, whereby the things that are essential for life have been progressively and more privatized. So yes, there's a lot to do. And I think anthropology can provide tools for that precisely by providing not alternative, because there is no transposition of historical experiences, but we can show that some solutions that have been adopted by people in some cases were functional in certain circumstances. So why not other solutions that may appear completely utopian or bizarre? Why shouldn't they be efficacious also?
Daniel.
A few years ago,
We may have to wait for the microphone, I don't know. It's being recorded, so I think.
A few years ago, the American Anthropological Society, or whatever professional society is there, has split into a scientific branch and another branch. Can you comment on that? Because you refer to anthropology as a scientific discipline. You know that in English, science means something else than you would have in German Wissenschaft or la science. This includes both the humanities in the European context, but not in the American context. And could you comment, because the Gates and other anthropologists who argue that anthropology is not science have been very influential, and to an outsider, I'm a natural scientist, this is a demolition of the discipline more than anything else that they propose.
Yes, I was, like many other French anthropologists, I was surprised and dismayed when some years ago, as you say, the American Anthropological Association decided that anthropology wasn't a science. It is a science, of course, and you know, the what I call naturalism took his, I think, ultimate form when at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, Heinrich Rickert, a German neo-Kantian philosopher, published a book which was called Naturwissenschaften und Kulturwissenschaften. He was the first to use the word sciences of culture in that sense now, and made a difference between them, which wasn't ontological but epistemological. There were sciences of nature aim at generalization, sciences of culture aim at individualization. And this has had profound results, in fact, in this division. I personally work with ecologists and other natural scientists, and I think that what we are practicing as anthropologists is a science of complexity, and there are a number of other sciences of complexity which try to understand the behavior of a great number of agents, and so it's among the most difficult sciences precisely, and so I find it, yes, I think it's how do you say in English, shooting yourself in the foot, no?
Okay, Colin?
Yeah. Hi. I guess I'm trying to think about, so these four ontologies, when you say that, so where they emanate from and who enacts them. So for instance, I mean, naturalism, I presume, you know, what naturalism is the Western way of thought, right? And so, but it would seem that to me that this ontology intersects with an entirely different classificatory scheme, which is social constructions. So for instance, it may be that Darwinian thought is naturalistic, and so that's the way we think about similarities and differences. But then we have these other categories, pet, pest, nuisance, livestock, in which we place animals that doesn't seem to be based on similarities and differences to us, right? So we all know, for instance, that pigs may be more intelligent than dogs, and so it's not because dogs are closer to us, you know, than pigs in their interiorities that, you know, they become pets and they become, you know, more worthy of moral regard. So I guess it's just, I'm just thinking about this possible collision between ontologies and social constructions. And when you sort of say that these are the four ontologies, like, what do they map on? Do they map onto cultures? Do they map onto cosmologies? Do they map onto sort of scientific classifications?
The first two things. First, I think anyone, anywhere, can make inferences in each of the four regimes. No, I can make animist inferences, and I make animist inferences all the time when especially when my computer doesn't work well. So I won't enter into the details, but it's obvious. No. There's a difference between making an animist or totemist assumption and being socialized into a totemist or a naturalist or an animist system. The difference is that the inferences that you usually make when you talk to your computer, to your cat, or to your potted plant, they don't extend beyond a certain domain, because they are inhibited in the socialization process. So they never make up something that is coherent as a system. That's one answer. The second answer is, as you may have gathered, I'm still a structuralist, and so any social phenomenon takes a relevance or a meaning only by contrast with others. So naturalist as such does not exist. Naturalist exists by contrast with totemism. So the transformational model that I propounded precisely as a sense because of that. So within this model, of course, there are huge differences. There are huge differences within the animist system, but there are huge differences within the analogous system. I have constant discussions with people like François Julien or Jeffrey Lloyd, for instance, who are both Hellenist and sinologists, as to the differences between China and Greece, of course. That for me, they are both analogous modes of identification, but of course the ontologies that result from the actual functioning of these modes of identification are very different, but they are based, I think, on the same principles. So there are differences within each of these modes of identification, but by contrast, globally, I think the way I define them are maintained. And it's a good thing. Otherwise, the world would be very, very drab if we had only four ontologies in that way.
So I think we can take one more question, and then we must yield to the reality of jet lag. Yes.
Hello. One question. I would like to ask you, how would you recommend us to? Thank you. How would you recommend us to approach situations where, due to, for example, developmental programs, different ways or modes of identifications, as you call, are put or are in relation?
You mean when what I would call a naturalist outlook towards development is being implemented in a
For example.
Yes, well, I think anthropologists should be in the forefront of these kind of programs, and the problem, I won't enter into details, but the problem, of course, is that usually people are not being asked what they are, what they really want, how they relate to their environment, etc., etc. So people think for them, no, that they need such and such a thing. I just give a short example, which I think is a good example of the staying power of an ontology. In some places in Amazonia where there's been deforestation and hunting is not possible anymore, some NGOs have started the breeding of forest animals, wild animals, that can be brought. So the capybara, for instance, etc., to provide meat. In all Amazonian houses, there are hundreds of pets everywhere, and most species can be tamed. And so there's a very direct relationship with these species, and people know these species. They are good, practical zootechnicians, let's say. But they never transformed this pet keeping into domestication. They've never attempted, or more than that, they've restrained their pets from reproducing in captivity. They never eat them, etc., etc., etc. So it's not a proto-domestication. And these programs function quite well. But I have several cases that when the zootechnicians from the NGOs leave the place and leave the animals, it's a complete collapse. Because it's the idea, and they have no restriction. I mean, Amazonian industry, general term, they have no restriction when they adopt animals that have been domesticated elsewhere already, because they come with the whole package, no? So in some cases they have pigs, for instance, because they've been domesticated. They are domestic. They are already in a slot. But domesticating a wild peccary is impossible. I mean, it's technically possible, but it's ideologically, ontologically impossible. So these kind of things, yes, are important and are not taken into account. But a minimum of ethnography is enough to deal with these questions.
So, ethnography is important, but there's always more to do. So let's thank Professor Descola.